Hi guys, this is Miss Wilson, and this is going to be our lecture on how energy flows through ecosystems. And we're doing this online because your book, while it's great, kind of breezes over this, and it's really important that you understand all these concepts because they're going to come back throughout this unit and later in the year as well. So we want to kind of connect everything all together here. Now, the pages in your book are listed on the screen and also on your notes sheet, so if there is anything that you're confused about, it might help to go back and read the book, but otherwise you can just take notes from this video. One other thing I want you to make sure of is that you're listening to what I say and not just writing down things on the slides. It should be pretty obvious from your notes outline that there are things that you're going to have to get from listening that are just not going to be on that slide for you to copy down. So let's start off here by talking about systems a little bit more. So you mentioned systems in your reading last night, and your book defines them basically as a set of components that function and interact in a regular way. Now, there's two types of systems that we need to talk about: open systems and closed systems. So in an open system, things can flow in and out of the system on their own very naturally. Whereas in a closed system, nothing can really get into the system and nothing can get out either. It's sealed. So this is a very airtight, temperature-tight kind of container. Think of it that way. Whereas a glass container would be more of an open system. It might not let everything in and out, but it's going to let certain things in and out. Now, matter and energy are going to behave differently in different types of systems. And when we talk about systems, we want to think of Earth, first of all, as a system. So if we think of the Earth as a whole, in terms of energy, it's actually an open system because energy comes in from the sun, and energy is also able to leave Earth back into space. So usually when we're talking about this energy, we're talking about heat energy or light energy, but it comes in and it goes out again. In terms of matter, matter is not a open system on Earth. It's kind of in a closed system for the most part. So if you think about it, matter can't really leave Earth. Whatever's here is kind of stuck here. So there's really not going to be any matter exiting. Also, there's probably not going to be much matter coming in, with the exception of maybe a meteorite every now and again. So in general, matter is going to act as if Earth is a closed system, and it's going to cycle around and around and around. And energy is going to act as if Earth is an open system. So it's going to come in, several things are going to happen to it once we get here, which we're going to talk about in this lesson and many other units to come. And then it's eventually going to become lost back to space in some way. So when we talk about systems, we can also talk about them on different levels of organization. So if we're talking about the Earth as a whole, in this class we're usually focused on the biosphere mostly, which is all of the living things on Earth. So there's your global scale, but you can also step down into these other levels of organization that we've already talked about in class. And depending on the level of organization, it might include all the biotic and abiotic things, which would be these top three right here, or it might just include living biotic things from community on down. Now, you can also go even smaller than the individual, and you can start getting into things like cells and tissues and organ systems and down as small as atoms and molecules. And these are all still systems. They're just systems of different scales. And depending on what we're talking about, we might want to look at what's happening in environmental science and a different level of system. All right, so no matter what scale you look at, there's two major rules that are governing what happens to energy in any of these systems. So you read about these rules last night, and the first rule, or the first law of what we call thermodynamics, has to do with the quantity of energy. So this is basically saying that energy can change forms, but it can't ever be created or destroyed. It's not going to come out of nowhere. It's not going to just disappear. Now, this is true for the universe. The total energy in the universe is going to stay the same. But because Earth is an open system in terms of energy, as we said, it can go in and out, it can be lost on Earth back into space. What this really means for food chains is number one, organisms can't create energy. They're not just going to get it from nowhere. They have to take it in one form and change it into a different form. The other thing that this means is that that energy can be lost back into space. So these are a couple of things that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about food chains. All the energy's got to go somewhere. In some cases, it does get stored in your body until you die, but eventually that's going to return somehow to the environment in a different form. So all your energy in has to equal your energy out. That's really what the first law of thermodynamics says. Now I just want to remind you there's lots of different types of energy too. So you talked about these last time in your last assignment. So thermal energy, heat, electromagnetic radiation, that's all those waves like light, sound, that kind of thing. Chemical energy is stored in bonds of molecules, and this is going to be super important in this upcoming lesson here. Kinetic energy is energy it takes to move, to actually do the work that you think about all the time. In most cases, you're using kinetic energy if you're seeing something happen. Nuclear energy is stored inside the neutrons and protons and how they kind of are held together in the atom. And that's going to be important later in the year, but we're going to kind of skip over it now. And electrical energy comes from electrons flowing around and creating a current. So again, that's going to be important later on. But remember, all these types of energy really are all just the capacity to do work. You can make something happen with all of these different forms of energy. So the second law of thermodynamics is all about the quality of that energy. So in the universe, there's this saying that basically chaos rules. And chaos has a special sciencey name called entropy. So this basically says that everything in the universe wants to be disordered. It wants to be all kind of messed up and broken in pieces. It's very unlikely that things will go the other way, that they'll actually become more organized. Most things are going to become less and less organized as time goes on. So for example, it's really unlikely that a broken egg is going to repair itself and is going to get back to its original state, that perfect intact egg. Things are going to tend to crumble and tend to decay as time goes on. So this happens with energy too. And basically what this means is that as time goes on, energy is going to become less and less organized. And as it becomes less and less organized, it's going to become less and less useful to us. So if we're talking about usable energy, that has low entropy, and what that means is it's very organized. It's very easy to use. If we have a energy that has changed form, it's going to become less usable. It's going to become more disorganized. And in other words, it's going to become lower quality. So as energy passes through an ecosystem, most of that energy gets lost. And when we say lost, remember, it's not really disappearing. But what that really means is it's such low quality that we can't use it anymore as organisms. So this is really what it means for ecosystems, is that the further along you go in a food chain, the more energy gets lost, or in other words, the lower quality your energy becomes, so that it is no longer usable. So another term that has to do with energy that's important to understand is efficiency. The efficiency of a process is basically how much work you can get out compared to the amount of energy that went in. So you're trying to see, are you getting a lot of use out of that energy? Were you able to capture a lot of it? So if something is very efficient, that means that you get lots of energy back out again compared to what you put in. If something is not efficient, it means that most of that energy was lost, or in other words, it became lower quality energy. Right? So, for example, if you have a water wheel, the amount of energy actually captured by that water wheel is its efficiency compared to the amount of water energy that actually went into that system. And this happens in natural systems too. You can see all of these different places where we lose energy. So in the end, the whole system might be kind of inefficient. You're losing a lot of energy here. However, every part of this system has its own efficiency. it is efficient to a different amount, and every part of this is still transferring enough energy that we can support a whole food chain eventually in most places. Okay, so let's revisit this idea of open and closed systems for a minute. So remember, in terms of energy, Earth is acting like an open system. The whole universe is a closed system because nothing's entering or leaving the entire universe. But in that universe, the energy is entering and leaving different planets and different bodies like Earth. So we can have energy come in from space, and we can also lose energy back to the environment. And we lose it in that lower quality energy. So that's our second law of thermodynamics, is that energy, as it gets used and as it gets transformed, is going to become lower and lower qualities, and we're also going to lose most of it for that reason. So we haven't talked much about mass yet. So when we talk about mass in food chains, we're usually talking about biomass. And there's that prefix bio again. So this is basically the total amount of living matter added up. So we'd usually use grams or kilograms to kind of measure this. And this would include basically anything that you'd consider alive. So your cells, body parts of organisms, all of the molecules that are part of the organism's body. Anything at all that would go into making up that mass of that organism. Now, this biomass is very connected to that energy we were just talking about, because all of this biomass basically comes from elements that were already on Earth, which have been rearranged by the energy coming in. So in most cases, what's happening is the electromagnetic radiation, which is energy coming in from the sun, is actually being converted into biomass. And don't forget, even though biomass is matter, it's also a type of chemical energy, because we remember that energy can be stored in chemical bonds. So here's where we get that relationship between matter and energy. Now, there's actually two ways that organisms can get energy. So there's two terms that kind of go along with this. If they are autotrophs, then that means that they make their own food. There's two ways they can do this: photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So these would be things like plants, algae, cyanobacteria, and a few other kinds of bacteria and protists. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, have to consume other organisms to obtain their food and to therefore obtain their energy. So these would be things like us. These would be herbivores. Remember, those are organisms that eat plants. Carnivores, those are meat eaters. Omnivores, remember, will eat a little bit of plants and meat as well. Detritivores and decomposers. These are a little tricky. We're going to go back over the difference between these. For now, I just want you to know that detritivores eat what we call detritus, which is basically dead material. In some cases, it may already be decaying. And decomposers are the ones that really help with that decay process. So in a lot of cases, detritivores will also be decomposers, but not all detritivores are truly considered decomposers. And I know that's a little confusing, so we're going to come back to that later. All right, one more important thing to remember here is that energy is really stored in the chemical bonds of the food. So the reason we really eat food is to get that energy out. And then when we eat that food, we get that energy and we can turn that into kinetic energy so that we can actually move around and do all the things that we need to do. And we do this by a process that we call respiration, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. So when we look at how energy moves through an ecosystem, there's two major steps that have to happen. The first step is that they need to convert that light energy from the sun, or in some cases it might be thermal energy instead. They need to take that and they need to convert it into food, which is our chemical energy. And that's going to happen through one of those processes, photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. And then once they've turned that into chemical energy in the form of food, then either that organism or another one who eats that organism can take that food and can break it down in order to release energy from it. And that would be the process of cellular respiration. And when decomposers feed, it's really still cellular respiration. Even though sometimes we will call it decomposition, it's really the same process. So the two kind of key essential processes here are photosynthesis and respiration, and they work together into basically what we call a biologic carbon-oxygen cycle, or sometimes it's just called the carbon cycle. And we're going to go into a lot more detail in just a second, but right now I want you to get the major ideas here. Photosynthesis is making the food, that's that chemical energy, and then respiration is breaking down that food in order to release the energy from those bonds. And it does release it in a certain form called ATP, which you hopefully remember from biology. Now, respiration, it's really important that you know this. It has to be used by all organisms, even autotrophs, even plants. Everything respires. And the reason for that is everything needs energy in order to survive. So, whether they make their own food or they get it from somewhere else, they still have to break it down to get the energy out. So this is going to form this cycle here between photosynthesis making the food and respiration breaking it back down. And we're going to talk a lot more about these in just a second. Before we get into the details, it's really important to remind you of a couple things that we see in chemical reactions. When you have a chemical reaction, it's often written much like this, where you have some formulas over here with plus signs in between, and then on the other side you have some more. In between there's this arrow, which kind of means that this stuff turns into this stuff. So all chemical reactions have both what we call reactants and products. And the reactants are always going to be found at the beginning of your equation, and that's what's reacting. That's what's either combining or breaking down. It's what you started with in the first place. And then these things are going to be transformed by this chemical reaction by breaking the bonds that they have and making new bonds, and they're going to be transformed into these products. So the products are what we produced. It's what we ended up with at the end of the reaction. So just make sure for all of the different equations we talk about next that you can identify what the products are, what goes in, and what the reactants are, what goes in, and what the products are, what comes out. All right, so we're going to talk about these one at a time, and I'm going to get kind of the oddball out of the way. So on your paper, find the column that talks about chemosynthesis, and you can see on the side of your paper there, you need to fill in some various things, like the chemical equation, so that would be the one with the formulas. Also, you need to know the word equation. What do each of these formulas basically mean? How would you say them out loud? Try to get what is the big purpose of this reaction, and then how is the energy transformed? In what form does it start, and what form is it left with in the end? Also, take note of which organisms perform it. So is it autotrophs that are doing this process? Is it heterotrophs? Is it both of them, which it might be in some cases? Also try to list some specific types when you can. And the last thing is you want to make note of where in the cell it occurs. Now this is the only one we're not going to do that for, just because you don't need to know that level of detail. So let's start with chemosynthesis. So chemosynthesis is making food just like photosynthesis, but it does it a little bit differently, because instead of using sunlight, it actually uses the heat from the interior of the earth, as well as some chemicals. That's why it's chemosynthesis, chemicals that combine and still make food just like photosynthesis does. So in chemosynthesis, you have carbon dioxide, you have water, and you have hydrogen sulfide, which is coming out of these vents, usually at the bottom of the ocean floor. Basically, you have this magma rising up to the surface, and it's carrying hydrogen sulfide with it. So all of these things combine with that heat from the interior of the earth, and they react to form sugar, and that's our food, really. This is glucose, which is a specific type of sugar. And they also form sulfuric acid, H2SO4, as a byproduct. So any place that chemosynthesis is taking place, it's going to be a really acidic environment. And it's really pretty incredible that so many things are actually able to survive in these areas. Now, this is not a common process. It's very, very rare. And it basically happens because these specialized bacteria live actually inside of other organisms down on the seafloor in these hydrothermal vent communities in the deep ocean. And they form the basis of this food chain. There are no plants down there. There's no sunlight that will reach all the way down there. So the bacteria actually live inside of things like tube worms and clams, and they create this food instead of using sunlight, using the heat and the chemicals from the earth. Right? So if you kind of compare it to a typical food chain that uses sunlight through photosynthesis, you see that you have some very different producers. You have the bacteria producing this here, and there's this really toxic, usually, byproduct of sulfides. But these aren't, for some reason, toxic to these animals that live around them, probably because they've evolved to be able to tolerate it. So everything else that we talk about today, like food chains and food webs, they're all going to work the same way, only instead of talking about your typical producers like plants and phytoplankton, these processes are going to start with those microbes, start with those bacteria instead. And then everything else is going to, in some way, either eat the bacteria or get the energy from the bacteria to move up the food chain. Alright, so now that we've covered kind of the oddball reaction, let's move into some of the more normal reactions that we might encounter here. So the first one that we want to talk about, our basis of most food chains, is really the process of photosynthesis. So in order to do photosynthesis, plants have to take in water and carbon dioxide, and they also have to have a sufficient amount of sunlight, and that's the energy that really starts off the reaction. And when they have that, that makes glucose again. Notice it's the exact same sugar as chemosynthesis made, and it also produces oxygen. So one of the things that a lot of people get confused with here is that they want to say that the purpose of photosynthesis is to make oxygen. And it turns out that's really not the case. The purpose for the plant, or whatever's performing photosynthesis, is really to make this glucose. It's wanting to make food, because that food is taking the light energy and turning it into chemical energy that organism can use. Now, it happens to make oxygen as a byproduct. That's really lucky for us because we need that oxygen in order to survive. We'll talk about why in a second. But that's not the point for the plant. That's not what the plant is after. The plant is after this glucose. So it takes that light energy, it turns it into chemical energy in the form of glucose, and this is happening in its chloroplasts. If it is a plant or an algae or anything like that. Now, some organisms can photosynthesize that don't actually have chloroplasts. In that case, it would just happen in their cytoplasm, and that would usually be because they don't have any organelles of any kind. So another thing to make sure you understand here is that the nutrients for photosynthesis are not coming mostly from the soil. This is a really common misconception, and people have thought this for a really long time. So if we go back to in the 1600s, there was this scientist von Helmont, and he basically set out to test this theory that the plant's mass, its nutrients, were coming from the soil. And he took a plant, he planted it, and he weighed the soil at the beginning, right when he planted it. He also weighed the plant. Then he grew that for 5 years. And when he came back and measured the plant, it had obviously gotten a lot bigger, but the soil mass had not changed much. In fact, nowhere near as much as the plant mass had. So this proves to us that that plant's mass is not coming mostly from the soil. And if you look back at the equation for photosynthesis and you think about where this is really coming from, okay, the water does somewhat come from the soil. We know that it's caught up in the water cycle before it gets there. And the water might be in the soil and soaked up by the roots. But a huge component of this is carbon dioxide. And actually, if we think back to chemistry and we really bring in the chemistry of what's happening here, if you were to take the mass of 6 moles of carbon dioxide, which is how much is going into this reaction, you can see it's so much higher than the mass of the water that's going into the reaction. So most of the mass of the plant, that big huge tree that you finally see at the end, is actually coming from carbon dioxide. Most of the mass of a tree is coming from the air. And that's a really hard concept to understand because we think of air as having no mass, having no weight, just kind of being weightless and nothing. But really, all this mass in that giant tree came mostly from the carbon dioxide through this process of photosynthesis. So that's a pretty incredible thing. All right, so photosynthesis made the food, it made the glucose, but that just stored the energy in those chemical bonds. So whether you're a plant or an animal that eats that plant, you have to get that energy out of those chemical bonds. You need to get the energy out of glucose. So the way you do that is by respiration. And there's two types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic. So let's start with aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen, and that's what makes it aerobic. Think air, it needs oxygen. And when you have oxygen, glucose combines with the oxygen in your body, and it will form water, which you usually breathe out, carbon dioxide, which you're also breathing out, and ATP. This is really the point of the whole process. This is the energy that we can actually use in our body. Now, this is technically still a form of stored energy, but it's a lot easier for our body to get at than glucose is. So this is that ready energy that we use to move around and do all the things that we need to do. Now, also as a byproduct of this reaction, it creates heat. This is where we talked about that second law of thermodynamics, and the energy is losing quality every time. This is what's happening, is that a lot of that energy is being lost. So some of that energy in those bonds, this isn't a really efficient process. It's going elsewhere as heat because it's no longer high enough quality for us to use. So the whole purpose of this reaction, again, is for us to get this energy, for us to get this ATP. I do a little chant with my biology kids. ATP is energy. ATP is energy. If you ever forget, that's a great way to remember it. So this is occurring in your mitochondria. If you're a eukaryote, remember these are cells that have a nucleus and other organelles. If you're a prokaryote, you don't have any of those things, so this would just occur in the cytoplasm at that point. But the most important thing to remember here is that all organisms have to perform respiration in some way, even plants, because they all need energy. They all need this ATP. You cannot survive without it. All right, so this first part of the cycle here, the amount of energy that's captured by photosynthesis and the amount of energy that's released by respiration all starts to play into how productive an ecosystem is. And we're going to talk about this more later. But just as an introduction, this is basically the rate at which producers are capturing energy. So this keeps track of where all our energy goes in the world and where in those ecosystems. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. Let's look a little bit more at ATP for a second. This is how we actually use ATP. Here's our ATP molecule, and it's like a fully charged battery. If we break this bond on the end here and pop this phosphate off, that actually releases energy to our body. So if you need to do something like power a cell process or move around, that's really what you're doing. You're popping off those phosphates and you're using that energy from the bond to power you. Now, one thing I want to come back to here is this is actually why we breathe. It's not to get oxygen. That's kind of an intermediate step. That's what everybody always wants to answer. Well, we need oxygen. Well, why do we need oxygen? And then everybody looks at me with a blank stare. So we need oxygen because we need to break down our food. If we don't have oxygen, we can't use aerobic respiration and we can't break down our food to get the energy out. If we want to get energy, we need oxygen. Now, this process is not super efficient, as we said. We do lose a lot of heat in the process, but actually when you compare it to most of our machines, like for instance here's a car, you can see that this process is actually much more efficient than most things that humans have actually built. So your body and those hundreds of thousands and millions of years of evolution have made it pretty much as efficient as it's going to get. Now, there is another type of respiration, and the reason it doesn't get used as much is it is not as efficient. And basically, anaerobic respiration means you don't have any oxygen. So since you don't have any oxygen, you can see the only reactant here is glucose. And in this process, that glucose is going to be turned into lots of different products. The first couple are the same as aerobic respiration. You're making CO2, you're making water, you're probably breathing most of those out in this case also. But in animals and many bacteria, you also make this product now, lactic acid. And this lactic acid is toxic if it builds up in your body. So this is one of the reasons you wouldn't want to do anaerobic respiration all the time. Now, you've felt this if you've ever had a muscle cramp. That's that lactic acid building up. And if it builds up enough, it can actually cause your cells to die. So that's part of the reason why you want to stretch and distribute that lactic acid so that it doesn't build up in one place. So this is a product of anaerobic respiration. Sometimes that happens in your body. If you're not getting oxygen fast enough, it has to resort to this. Now, the other problem with anaerobic respiration is you'll notice it only makes 2 ATP. If we go back to aerobic for a second, that made 36. That's a huge difference. And it turns out that this is not enough energy to really even make this process worth it most of the time. It's just not giving you enough from it. And you're losing a lot of heat in this process too. You're not going to make enough energy to sustain a large organism. So while our cells will revert to this process from time to time when they get desperate, they're not going to live on this all the time. However, small organisms like yeast and bacteria can survive on this because they don't need as much energy in the first place. And that's how you get organisms that live in anoxic environments, environments that have no oxygen. It's because they're using this form of respiration to break down their food. Now, one example of this is the organisms that are in yogurt. They create that lactic acid, and that's why you get that sour taste. However, there's also another version of the process. So if you have a plant or a fungus or a yeast, in other words, it will actually go through anaerobic respiration also, but it makes a different product. So this is really called fermentation when it's this type. And in this case, they're not making lactic acid, they're making alcohol. Now, alcohol can also be toxic if it builds up, if there's too much of it. So this can also be problematic for a lot of organisms, and you're still only making 2 ATP. So that's always an issue as well. All right, so at this point, you've gotten the energy out of your food. Now, all of these other molecules, it turns out, can also be really useful because you can use them and rearrange them to store energy in different ways. So this is how we store energy in our molecules. If you remember from biology, you have 3 classes of macromolecules that you eat: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those are all large molecules with lots of energy. They can be broken down into glucose, or they can be broken down into their other parts and put back together to make different molecules. So we can either use them to fuel cellular respiration in the form of glucose, or we can use them as building blocks for everything else in our body as we grow. And this really allows us to build up that biomass. This is where the biomass comes from. We take our food and we rearrange it in lots of different ways. And a lot of times we use the energy, the ATP, from respiration in order to put those things together into larger and larger molecules. And those pieces that come from our food form these huge macromolecules that form our body and grow our tissues. So just to recap here for a moment, these are some really important points you need to make sure you understand. First of all, plants are using photosynthesis to make food. Oxygen's actually kind of a waste product for them, but that's lucky for us because we need oxygen to do aerobic respiration. All organisms, including plants, have to respire because they have to get energy out of their food. Every time we use that energy that we got from our food, we lose most of it. And the rest of it is not as high quality as what we started with in the first place, because every time energy is transformed, it loses quality. And the plants are actually getting most of their biomass from carbon dioxide in the air, not from minerals, not from the soil. A small portion of their mass comes from water, but actually most of that water that they take in photosynthesis is going to be lost by the plant breathing out in a process called transpiration, which we're going to come back to later. So this forms that basis of that carbon cycle, which we'll talk about in more detail later in this unit. It also forms the basis for food chains and food webs. And before we can really talk about that, let's talk about an organism's niche. So basically what a niche is an organism's role in its ecosystem. And it can include lots of different things. It basically includes all the interactions that organism has with both the biotic things, the other living things, and the abiotic components of the ecosystem. And part of that organism's niche, its role, is what trophic level it's in. So every time you see this word troph or trophic, we're talking about energy. So this is basically the number of times that energy got transferred in order to get to the organism. That's going to be its trophic level. So producers are on the first trophic level because the energy was transferred once, just from the sun to them. And then primary consumers are on the second trophic level because they eat the producers. These are herbivores. They're plant eaters in most cases. They could be an omnivore sometimes. And they are 2 steps away from that origin of the energy on Earth. It had to go through the producers first and then get to them. So second trophic level. The third trophic level is going to be your secondary consumers. So these guys eat the primary consumers. So they're either going to be carnivores or omnivores at that point. And then the tertiary consumers on the 4th trophic level eat the secondary consumers. The quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers. And sometimes in certain ecosystems, if it's productive enough, you might get 5th level consumers, which eat quaternary consumers. By this point, the energy has passed through 6 different transformations. And because of that, it's really low quality, and there's not a lot of energy left in the first place. So you don't usually have a lot of consumers up this high in a trophic level. They usually are mostly concentrated towards this end. So if we go back and we trace the flow of energy again, the energy is coming in from the sun, it's going to those producers. And then those producers are capturing it through photosynthesis, but they're also using some of that energy through respiration in order to support themselves and grow their bodies larger. And then those producers get eaten. And when they get eaten, those animals are using the molecules from the producers as food, and they're respiring. And every time something respires, a lot of that energy gets lost as heat. So you see our arrows getting smaller here because less energy is being passed on from the producer to the consumer. When the consumer is eaten by another consumer or by a decomposer, you lose even more energy. So the more steps in your food chain, the more energy is going to be lost. And really, all a food chain is a simple diagram that shows the flow of energy. It shows it from the source, which is usually the sun, through the producers, and then through a series of consumers in one line. So this is not accounting for them eating different things. It's just one simple, here's the path of energy. And because we're showing the path of energy, that's what the arrows really mean. The arrows show the direction the energy moved in. Or in other words, they show where that energy went when something ate another thing. For this reason, these arrows should always point at the thing that is eating the other one. So in many cases, it may help to think that they point at the predator, not the prey, because they point to where the energy goes. In some cases, it may not be a predator. It may be an herbivore that's eating a plant. It's still going to point towards the herbivore because that's where the energy went. It went from the plant to the herbivore. So all a food web is just several overlapping food chains, because we know that in nature you don't just eat one thing. You have to usually have quite a variety of food. So the food web just shows all of those interconnections, but the arrows still go the same way. The arrows should still always show the flow of energy. Now, this energy can also be shown in what we call an ecological pyramid. And basically, what this is just rearranging that food chain into a pyramid shape so that we can kind of see how much energy and how much other things are available on each level of this food chain. And these levels are the trophic levels that these organisms are in. So when you do this, you put the start of the food chain, or the producers, at the base of the pyramid, and then you build up. So your top level consumers wind up at the top of the pyramid. So there's three different kinds of pyramids you might see. The first one is a pyramid of numbers. This is literally just counting how many organisms there are in each trophic level of that ecosystem. And this can be useful if you just want to compare how many organisms it would take to support that next level. So you're always going to see pyramids like this where you have tons of producers. And that's because so much of that energy is lost, you can't have as many primary consumers depending on them. And you're going to have even less secondary consumers because there's going to be less energy left at that top part because of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, you could also see a pyramid of biomass, and the units in this are going to be different. So instead of numbers of individuals, which is what's really being shown here, your units in the pyramid of biomass are going to be mass units like grams or kilograms, or in some cases you're going to find it done per unit area, so grams per cubic meter, to show us that if we just measured a meter of this is how much biomass we would come up with. So this is helpful because it shows us how much material of the ecosystem is actually from each level. So again, you're going to have more biomass, more material actually coming from producers. And then that biomass is going to be passed on through food as these other organisms eat it and then make that biomass part of their own body as well. Now, there's a third type of pyramid you might see, and this is a pyramid of energy. And usually these units are going to be calories, often calories per square meter. Actually, what we call calories in the US is technically a kilocalorie everywhere else. This may also be done in a certain period of time, like a year. This is really helpful because this shows us exactly how much energy is left on each level. And you can see that that decreases dramatically as time goes on because of that second law of thermodynamics. We're losing most of this as low quality energy as heat back to the environment. So there's something called the 10% rule. And this is going to help us predict how much biomass or how much energy gets passed on to the next trophic level. And this basically says that every time we go up one trophic level, only 10% of the energy and biomass gets passed on. The other 90% of that energy or biomass is lost as either heat or waste products from the animal. And therefore, every trophic level can only support about 10% of the amount of organisms as the previous level. Now, this is approximate. It is not always exactly 10%, and you can see that in this example, it is certainly not 10%. It's not always going to work, but it's a good rule to stick by. And it does tend to work very well with things like biomass, where you will see a change of about 10% each level. And you can see the same thing happening with the number of organisms here as well. So again, this is happening because most of that energy is actually going to get lost. Very little of it is going to be passed on to the next level of the food chain. This explains a couple of things. This is why we don't have a lot of top-level consumers. Those top-level consumers don't have a lot of energy left available to them by the time it passes through these other transformations. So it just can't support a lot of these guys. There has to be lots of producers and lots of lower-level consumers in order to produce the apex predators, those top-level consumers. And this goes for biomass also. You need lots of mass coming in order for it to make it all the way there, because a lot of that mass is going to disappear in waste products throughout an organism's life. Even waste products like breathing. You're breathing out tons of molecules all the time. So that's all being lost back to the environment again. Um, this is also why those top level consumers tend to have huge ranges. They have to wander over large areas, huge territories, because they have to obtain so much energy in order to survive. And these tertiary consumers or higher level consumers usually spend almost all, if not all of their life trying to find food, because there is so little energy left to them at that level of the pyramid. So this is just a different environments pyramid. You can see this one is a desert and this one is a temperate forest, but you can see that basically the same patterns happen no matter where you are. However, there is one key factor that will determine how many organisms you support, and that is at the base of your pyramid, and that is your producers. So we have a term for that. That is called primary productivity. Primary productivity is basically how much photosynthesis is giving you in terms of biomass and in terms of energy. So how much are those producers actually making? And we usually measure the energy that they're making in joules and the biomass that they're making in grams or kilograms, maybe even larger units in some cases. In general, when you have more producers, you're going to get a more productive ecosystem. You're going to have higher primary productivity. That means that those plants are making so many molecules of food, they're making so much energy that that can support all the other organisms that are living there. So the higher that primary productivity is, the more organisms you can have. So it's always good to have a high primary productivity if you want your biodiversity to be high in that area. More things are going to be able to survive there if you've got a lot of producers in the first place. So that brings us to how we calculate productivity. And there's an equation for this, which you need to know. Basically, net primary productivity is all of the primary productivity of those plants, all of the things that they're producing. But there's two things that we need to look at in order to get that. So the first one is gross primary productivity. So this is actually all the sunlight that they capture. And you can see that they actually really don't capture most of it. So most of what comes in does actually get absorbed. But they do capture about 1% from the sun. And that's your gross primary productivity. That's all the energy they were able to absorb in the first place. However, out of that energy that they actually absorbed, it doesn't all go to other organisms, because remember, the plant needs energy too in order to do its processes. So the plant is going through cellular respiration, and by doing that, it's losing a lot of its energy, actually about 60%. So in order to really see how much primary productivity there is in an ecosystem, we have to subtract that. Since they've already used that energy, it's not going to be available to other organisms. So that's why we use this term net primary productivity for the total. Now, if you compare this around the world, you can see here these really dark green areas are areas of really high productivity on land. And you can see that some of the highest areas are areas like forests, especially tropical rainforests, but even deciduous forests are very high primary productivity. And if you think about that, that's because there's so many producers there. There's so many trees and other plants that are going through photosynthesis and making all this energy and making all this food for everything else. Now, if you look in the oceans, you actually also have some really big hot spots of primary productivity there, and they tend to be around coral reefs because you have organisms there that are producing lots of biomass and lots of energy. So take a minute and look at the different biomes here and kind of compare what their primary productivity is. If you think about these biomes, biomes with low primary productivity don't have many organisms in them because they just can't support it. Biomes with high primary productivity have tons of different organisms, lots of times millions, maybe even billions of different species. And that's because they have so much energy being produced by those plants that they're able to support all of those organisms in that food chain or food web. Now, there is another type of productivity called secondary productivity. And that's basically the rate at which consumers convert their own energy into usable biomass. So that energy that they took into food, they turn it into mass for their own body. And that's the secondary productivity part. So once again here, a lot of that energy and a lot of that mass is going to get lost to the environment, either out through heat from cellular respiration, or when something eats it, it's going to lose biomass that way, and eventually it will be returned to the environment in any case. But any biomass that it holds onto, in other words, any ways that it grows its body, that's really secondary productivity. Any way that it's storing those molecules and building up that biomass is your secondary productivity. All right, so we've covered a lot of information in here. I just want you to really make sure that you understand the application of those laws of thermodynamics. And in order to practice this a little bit, you do have a quick activity on your paper where you have a food web, and I want you to go ahead and turn that into a trophic pyramid. Be careful because some of the animals could go in multiple levels, so if you need to put them more than once, that's fine. And try to do that while using some of these vocabulary words that we've talked about to describe their niche or their role in an ecosystem. Also talk about what's happening to the biomass and energy there. We're going to practice this more in class, but this will be super important throughout this unit and every unit that we go through from here on out. So please let me know if you have any questions. I will see you in class later on, and I hope you have a good night.